smaller than New York City, got kicked out of a country that didn't want it anymore. No natural resources, no army worth mentioning, not even enough fresh water for its own people. The Prime Minister cried on national television. Experts predicted it would collapse within months. 60 years later, that same island has a higher GDP per capita than the United States. Its airport is rated the best in the world. Its sovereign wealth fund controls over $700 billion in assets across every continent. And if you ask historians how it happened, most of them will point to one man who ruled for 31 years and did things most democracies would never tolerate. This is the story of how Lee Kuan Yew built Singapore, and why his model terrifies as many people as it inspires. Singapore's independence wasn't planned, it was an accident. For 2 years, it had been part of Malaysia, a merger designed to give the island protection and resources. But by 1965, ethnic and political tensions made the arrangement impossible. Malaysia's parliament voted Singapore out. No referendum, no negotiation. Lee Kuan Yew, the man who'd spent years fighting for merger, suddenly had a country he never wanted to lead alone. The numbers were catastrophic. 2 million people crammed onto an island with zero oil, zero minerals, and a jungle climate that made agriculture nearly impossible. 70% unemployment in some neighborhoods, race riots still fresh in memory. British military bases, the largest employer, preparing to withdraw. Most post-colonial nations in the 1960s chose one of two paths: align with the West and take foreign aid, or align with the Soviets and nationalize everything. Lee looked at both options and decided on something different. He would build a country that worked like a corporation. Not as a metaphor, actually like a corporation. And he had about 18 months before the money ran out. Lee's first priority wasn't democracy or freedom or culture, it was jobs. Without employment, people starve. When people starve, governments collapse. Singapore had no time for theory. So Lee did something unusual. He made Singapore attractive to the very multinational corporations that most developing nations were trying to kick out. While India was nationalizing industries and Tanzania was implementing Ujamaa socialism, Singapore was cold-calling executives in Texas and Tokyo, offering them something simple: zero corruption, functional courts, English-speaking workers, tax incentives, political stability guaranteed by a government that would do whatever it took to keep factories running. And here's the part that made other post-colonial leaders furious. Lee admitted his country was dependent. He said it out loud. He told foreign CEOs that Singapore had no choice but to serve their interests, because without foreign capital, the island would starve. It worked. By 1970, companies like Texas Instruments and Hewlett-Packard had opened manufacturing plants in Singapore. Unemployment dropped from double digits to under 4%. But Lee had a problem. Most countries that rely on cheap labor stay poor. The factory jobs pay just enough to survive, but not enough to build wealth. And the moment wages rise, the factories move to cheaper countries. Lee needed a way to force savings, build infrastructure, and create a local capital base before the factories left. So he invented something that still doesn't exist anywhere else in quite the same form. It's called the Central Provident Fund. The CPF isn't a pension, it isn't Social Security. It's a mandatory savings account that every worker and employer pays into, but the government controls how you use it. Here's how it works. You get a job, 20% of your salary goes into your CPF account. Your employer adds another 17%. That's 37% of your total compensation locked away. You can't spend it on a car, you can't withdraw it for a vacation. You can use it for 3 things: housing, healthcare, and retirement. Now here's the elegant part. Singapore doesn't build public housing the way Europe does. It builds high-quality apartments and sells them to citizens at subsidized rates, but only if you use your CPF money. Suddenly, every Singaporean has a massive financial incentive to stay employed, because employment builds your CPF balance, and your CPF balance is the only way to own a home. Today, 90% of Singaporeans own their apartments, but they don't really own them, not fully. The leases last 99 years. When the lease expires, the property reverts to the state. So technically, you're renting from the government for a century, using money the government forced you to save. And because everyone's wealth is tied up in these apartments, no one wants to risk political instability that might crash the housing market. It's a system that turns citizens into stakeholders without giving them full autonomy. Lee called it pragmatism. Critics called it something else. Lee Kuan Yew didn't believe in Western-style democracy. He said so repeatedly. He thought free speech was a luxury poor countries couldn't afford. He thought opposition parties were a waste of time if they didn't have better ideas. He thought the press should support national development, not criticize it. And he had the legal system to enforce it. Singapore still has laws against sedition, criminal defamation, and publishing false news. Journalists who pushed too hard found themselves in court. Opposition politicians faced bankruptcy from defamation suits. Public protests require police permits that are almost never granted. The Internal Security Act allows the government to detain anyone indefinitely without trial if they're considered a threat to national security. Lee used it. Not often, but enough that everyone knew it was there. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Singapore worked in the narrow sense that the country got rich. GDP per capita went from under $500 in 1965 to over $70,000 today. Crime rates dropped to among the lowest in the world. Corruption indices rank Singapore cleaner than Sweden. The education system produces test scores that make American schools look broken. But the model only works if the people in charge are competent and not kleptocrats. Lee's party, the People's Action Party, has won every election since independence, not through fraud, through control of media, gerrymandering, legal intimidation, and genuine competence. They deliver results, so people vote for them, and because people vote for them, the system never gets tested by a true transfer of power. Singapore's success created a paradox that still hasn't been resolved. Other countries looked at the model and tried to replicate it. China studied it extensively. Rwanda's government cites it as inspiration. The UAE borrowed parts of it. But here's what they miss. Lee Kuan Yew wasn't just authoritarian, he was incorruptible. He paid his ministers the highest government salaries in the world, sometimes over $1 million a year, specifically to reduce the temptation for bribery. He created anti-corruption bureaus that reported directly to the Prime Minister and had the power to arrest anyone, including his own friends. When his wife's law firm was accused of getting favorable treatment, he recused himself from related decisions and published his tax returns. Most authoritarian governments don't do this. They use control to extract wealth, not build it. So when people say Singapore proves authoritarianism works, they're technically describing a sample size of one, led by a man who happened to combine ruthlessness with a genuine lack of personal greed. And even then, questions remain. Singapore's fertility rate is one of the lowest on Earth. Young people report high levels of stress and dissatisfaction despite material wealth. Creative industries struggle under media restrictions. The political system has no clear mechanism for reform if the ruling party ever becomes incompetent or corrupt. Lee died in 2015. His son is now Prime Minister. The Singapore model fascinates people because it breaks the rules we're taught about development. We're told democracy and capitalism go together. Singapore has capitalism without full democracy. We're told freedom is necessary for prosperity. Singapore has prosperity with restrictions on freedom.
We're told you can't plan an economy without Soviet-style failure. Singapore's government plans everything and succeeds. But the model has limits that don't show up in GDP charts. It works for a small island where the government can monitor everything. It might not scale to a country of 300 million people. It works when the leadership is disciplined. It falls apart when they're not. It works when citizens accept the trade-off between autonomy and security. It fractures when they don't. And it works in a world where manufacturing jobs existed. In an age of AI and automation, the original playbook doesn't apply. Here's the question no one wants to answer directly. If you were born into poverty in a failing state and someone offered you Lee Kuan Yew's model, limited freedom but guaranteed housing, jobs, safety, and schools, would you take it? Most people in comfortable democracies say no. Most people in actual
You ever wonder where money actually comes from? Like, you work your job, get your paycheck, put it in your bank account, and then what? It just sits there, right? Wrong. Your money is moving through an entire invisible world of banks, hedge funds, insurance companies, and institutions you've never heard of, multiplying itself in ways you probably don't understand. Welcome to the financial system, an interconnected web of organizations that creates, moves, and multiplies money all over the world. And here's the crazy part. Most people have no idea how any of it actually works. By the end of this video, you're going to understand the entire financial machine, what the biggest institutions actually do, and how they all work together to keep the global economy running, or sometimes crashing. Let's jump in. First stop, where money gets created. Central banks are basically the government's arm in the finance world. Every country has one. The US has the Federal Reserve. The UK has the Bank of England. China has the People's Bank of China. And you can think of central banks as playing God with the economy. Here's how they do it. Monetary policy. They control two things, the amount of money in the economy and interest rates. And they use these tools to hit three main goals: price stability, full employment, and overall economic growth. Let me give you an example. Let's say the economy is slowing down, recession fears, people losing jobs. The central bank uses what's called expansionary monetary policy. They cut interest rates and pump cash into the system, either by literally printing it or through something called quantitative easing. Now, borrowing money becomes super cheap. Businesses take out loans to expand, people buy houses with cheap mortgages, more spending, more jobs, more money in people's pockets. Boom! Economy is humming. It's why you hear presidents like Trump pressuring the Fed to cut rates. A booming economy makes them look good. But here's the catch. All that extra money floating around causes prices to skyrocket, inflation. So when inflation gets out of hand, central banks slam the brakes. They jack up interest rates and suck money out of the economy through quantitative tightening. They sell government bonds, which pulls cash out of circulation and parks it at the central bank. This cools inflation down. So central banks are the puppet masters. They decide which way the economy goes and how much money is out there. That's why everyone freaks out when the Fed raises rates. Now let's talk about where your money actually lives. Commercial banks. JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Chase. This is where most people interact with the financial system. Your paycheck lands there, you pay bills from there, maybe you have a mortgage through them. But their real job is moving money from savers to borrowers. Think of it like this. On one side, you've got surplus units, people with extra cash sitting around, retirees with pensions, companies with profits. On the other, you've got deficit units, startups that need capital, people buying homes, businesses expanding. Banks sit in the middle. They take all that idle money from savers and lend it out to people who can actually put it to work. This keeps money flowing through the economy instead of just sitting there doing nothing. But here's where it gets wild. Banks don't just lend out the exact deposits they have. When they issue a new loan, they actually create new money. They're lending you money they don't actually have. Traditionally, this was explained with something called a reserve rate. Say it was 10%. If a bank had 10 million in reserves, they could lend out 100 million. Guess what the reserve rate is these days for most major economies? 0%. Now, this doesn't mean they can loan out infinite money. There are capital requirements, liquidity rules, credit checks, all that. But this ability to transform savings into loans and expand the money supply in the process is what makes commercial banks the beating heart of the modern financial system. All right, now we're getting into the big money. Pension funds are the biggest financial institutions on the planet. They control over $60 trillion worldwide. Their job? Make sure people still get paid after they stop working. But they don't just stick that money in a savings account earning 2%. That's pathetic. They aim for 6 to 7% a year by diversifying across everything: stocks, government bonds, corporate bonds, real estate. Not just any real estate. We're talking landmarks. The Ontario Teachers' Pension Fund owns Hudson Yards in New York, massive hotels, entire office buildings. And they don't stop there. They pour billions into hedge funds, venture capital, and private equity. In fact, pension funds are the largest single source of capital for those guys. So while pensions might feel invisible when you're young, they're quietly one of the most powerful players in global finance. Now, mutual funds are similar, but for regular people. Instead of needing millions to play in the markets, anyone can throw a few $1,000 into a mutual fund and get professional management. Vanguard, Fidelity, BlackRock. Here's how they work. They pool money from thousands of everyday investors and buy giant baskets of assets: stocks, bonds, real estate, whatever the strategy calls for. When you invest $5,000 into a $100 million fund, you own 0.005% of everything they own. If the fund goes up 5%, you just made $250 before fees. The big selling point: diversification. Imagine trying to manually buy 500 different stocks with $5,000. Tedious and stupid. Mutual funds give you access to a much wider spread, and they come in two flavors: actively managed funds, hire professional stock pickers trying to beat the market, and passively managed funds just copy an index like the S&P 500 and call it a day. Since passive funds don't need fancy analysts, their fees are way cheaper. But mutual funds are for peasants. The big dogs park their money in hedge funds. Hedge funds like Bridgewater, Citadel, and Jane Street are the money-making playgrounds of the ultra-rich. Unlike mutual funds that anyone can jump into, hedge funds are only open to accredited investors. In the US, that means you've got at least $1 million net worth, not including your house, or you're making $200K a year. Why? Because hedge funds can be insanely risky. They raise cash from pension funds and wealthy individuals and use it to place some of the boldest bets in finance. Here's the funny thing. Most hedge funds actually underperform the S&P 500, but the rare ones that hit it big, they absolutely crush it. Jim Simons averaged 70% returns for decades. That's triple Warren Buffett's average. But this market magic comes at a cost. Most hedge funds charge 2 and 20, a 2% management fee on all the money they manage and 20% of the profits they make you. And unlike mutual funds that just buy assets and hope they go up, hedge funds bet on literally anything: stocks going up, stocks going down, currencies crashing, interest rates moving, oil prices, crypto, even election outcomes. They get to do this with way fewer regulations. They short sell, they use massive leverage, borrowing money to supercharge their trades. They use complex derivatives like options, futures, and swaps. And these days, they're using AI to run trades. The added risk and greed often results in prison time for the managers, but when they win big. Investment banks like Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and Citigroup are basically the corporate matchmakers of Wall Street. They connect big businesses, governments, and institutions with money, lots of money. They do a bunch of things, but their bread and butter comes down to three big ones: taking companies public, mergers and acquisitions, and raising capital. When a private company wants to go public, they call an investment bank. The bankers figure out what the company's worth, handle mountains of paperwork, and most importantly, hype it up to investors so the stock actually sells. Like when Morgan Stanley took Facebook public in 2012 and raised $16 billion in a single day. That's the GDP of a small country hitting your account overnight. Then you've got mergers and acquisitions. When one company wants to buy another, things get messy. You've got to value the target, negotiate terms, comb through financials to make sure you're not buying a dumpster fire. That's why companies hire investment banks with armies of analysts to run the numbers and keep billion-dollar deals from collapsing. Third, raising money. When companies need more cash than they can get from a normal bank loan, investment banks step in. They help issue corporate bonds, arrange massive loans, or sell more shares. Their key skill, convincing investors to hand over their cash, and they're really good at it. So good they even sell scams sometimes. Now, private equity firms are basically house flippers but for companies. Blackstone, KKR, Apollo. They raise mountains of money from pension funds and insurance companies, buy businesses, fix them up, and flip them for massive profits. Here's the sneaky play. They use leverage, as much leverage as possible. Say they're buying a $100 million company. They'll put down $20 million and borrow $80 million. Then they dump that $80 million in debt onto the company's books. So if the company goes south, the private equity firm doesn't owe anything. This is called a leveraged buyout. After the takeover, they cut costs, fire people, strip assets, and flip it in a few years for 3 to 5 times what they paid. Like when Blackstone bought Hilton Hotels for $26 billion, put in $5.6 billion of their own money, and walked away with $14